In the glittering ballrooms of Mayfair, Lady Elara Vance is known as the Silent Diamond, a debutante of incomparable beauty who never utters a word and never removes her silk gloves. The Ton thinks it's Victorian modesty. Captain Arthur Stirling thinks it's a challenge. But Elara isn't silent by choice. One note from her throat could bring the walls of Almack's crumbling down, and if she stays away from the salt tides for too long, the skin beneath her corset will turn to emerald scales. The air in St. James's Palace was a thief. It stole the moisture from Elara's throat and the suppleness from her skin, replacing it with the cloying sense of beeswax, stale perfume, and the scorched wick smell of 1,000 guttering candles. To the rest of the Ton, and this was the pinnacle of their existence, the moment a debutante was bloomed before the Queen. To Elara, it was a slow, gilded suffocation. She stood perfectly still, a statue carved from moonlight and silk. Her gown was a masterpiece of gossamer white, cinched so tightly at the waist that it pressed her corset directly against the secret she carried beneath her ribs. It began as a dull ache, then sharpened into a frantic, rhythmic itch. The scales were rising. She could feel them, hard and cold like sea glass, pushing against the tender skin of her side. Every shallow breath was a gamble. If she expanded her lungs too far, the sharp edges of her true nature would tear through the fine cambric of her chemise. "Lady Elara Vance," the herald announced, his voice echoing through the chamber. Elara glided forward, and she did not walk so much as she flowed, a trick of muscle memory from a life spent in the currents. She sank into a deep, graceful curtsy before Queen Charlotte. The Queen's eyes, sharp as a raptor's, drifted over Elara's bowed head. "The Silent Diamond," the Queen remarked, her voice a dry rasp. "A pity such a beautiful instrument produces no sound. Is it true, child? Not a single word for your Queen?" Elara looked up, her lips pressed into a small, enigmatic smile. She bowed her head again, a gesture of profound humility that masked the vibration rattling in her chest. If she spoke, if she even whispered a "Your Majesty," the crystal chandeliers above them would likely rain down in 1,000 lethal shards. The bower was restless tonight, stirred by the sheer proximity of so many bodies and the stifling lack of salt in the air. "And modesty is a rare jewel, Your Majesty," her aunt, Lady Danbury, interjected smoothly, stepping in to fill the silence, as she had been paid handsomely to do. The ordeal ended, but the escape was an illusion. As Elara retreated toward the edges of the ballroom, the dryness became an agony. She felt as though she were turning to stone. She needed water. Not the tepid punch being served by liveried footmen, but the biting, frigid brine of the Atlantic. She sought the shadows of a heavy velvet curtain, hoping for a moment to press her gloved hand to her ribs and steady her racing heart. But the shadows were already occupied. A man stood there, framed by the moonlight, spilling through a tall window. He was dressed in the formal blues of the Royal Navy, but the uniform looked like a cage on him. He was bronzed by a sun that did not shine on London, and his eyes had the restless, searching quality of a man used to watching the horizon. Elara froze. The air between them suddenly felt heavy, charged with a sudden, violent static. "It is a bit much, isn't it?" the man said, his voice deep and weathered. "The heat, the pretense. I find myself looking for the nearest exit before the walls start closing in." Elara offered a stiff, polite nod, intending to move past him, but he stepped forward, the light catching the silver braid on his shoulder. "Captain Arthur Stirling," he said, bowing with a rugged sort of grace. "And you must be Lady Elara. I've heard the whispers. Or rather, the lack of them." The name hit her like a rogue wave. Sterling. The memories surged up, are unbidden and terrifyingly vivid. A moonless night 3 years ago off the coast of Cornwall. A heavy fog. The Hesperus, a magnificent merchant vessel, veering too close to the jagged teeth of the Maiden's Reef. Elara had been younger then, her hunger for song louder than her caution. She had sat upon the rocks and let out a single, crystalline note of longing. It hadn't been an act of malice, but of curiosity. She had watched the ship splinter. She had watched the sailors scream as the sea claimed them. And she had seen one man clinging to a piece of wreckage, his eyes locked onto the silhouette on the rocks. Not with fear, but with a haunting, soul-deep recognition. It was him, the man from the wreck. Arthur Sterling was looking at her now with that same piercing intensity, his brow furrowed as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had haunted him for 1,000 nights. He stepped closer, and for a terrifying second, Elara smelled it. Not the perfume of the ballroom, but the unmistakable, sharp scent of dried brine and old timber clinging to his coat. "You have a very particular look about you, Lady Elara," Arthur murmured, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. "A look I've only seen once before. It was in the middle of a graveyard of ships, just before the water took my crew." Elara's heart hammered against her scales. She felt a bead of sweat trickle down her neck, and where it touched her collarbone, she feared the shimmer of green might already be visible. She couldn't speak. She couldn't run. She simply stood there, the silent diamond, praying that the captain couldn't hear the roar of the ocean currently drowning out the sound of the violins. "Tell me," Arthur said, reaching out a hand as if to touch the silk of her glove. "Why is it that when I look at you, I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a ship, waiting for the storm to break?" Elara didn't wait for him to finish. With a sharp, desperate incline of her head, she turned and vanished into the crowd, the silk of her gown rasping against her scales like a warning. The memory of the Hesperus was a phantom limb that throbbed whenever the London sky turned the color of bruised pewter. Captain Arthur Sterling did not believe in ghosts, but he believed in the fog, that thick, unnatural shroud that had tasted of iron and echoed with a melody no human throat could sustain. He had spent 3 years convincing himself that the song had been a trick of the wind, a collective hallucination of a dying crew. Yet, looking at Lady Elara Vance across the crowded parlors of Mayfair, he felt the same primal shiver that had preceded the splintering of his hull. He followed her, not with the practiced grace of a suitor, but with the silent, stalking patience of a hunter. He watched her slip away from the heat of the drawing room, her movement too fluid, her spine too rigid. She bypassed the library and the dining hall, steering herself toward the rear of the estate, where the great glass conservatory bloomed like a tropical lung in the middle of the city. Inside, the air was a thick, humid soup of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine. For Arthur, it was suffocating. For Elara, it appeared to be a sanctuary. He watched through the screen of a towering fan palm as she reached the center of the glass house. She looked broken by the evening's festivities. She leaned against a stone pedestal, her shoulders heaving in a way that suggested a frantic struggle for air. She tore at the silk gloves that reached her elbows, stripping them away with a desperate ferocity. In the moonlight, her hands seemed to shimmer with a faint iridescent sheen, not like jewelry, but like the wet skin of a trout pulled fresh from a stream. Then she did something that stopped his heart. She tilted her head back, her throat working as if she were trying to swallow the very humidity of the room. A small, choked sound escaped her. Not a word, not even a sigh. It was a low, resonant hum, yet a vibration so deep it seemed to bypass Arthur's ears and strike directly at the marrow of his bones. It was the note, the exact haunting frequency from the reef. The hum shifted, ascending just a fraction of a tone. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The air in the conservatory didn't just vibrate, it shattered. Every crystal punch bowl, every delicate glass flute on the nearby refreshment table, and the very beams of the greenhouse roof above her head exploded simultaneously. A rain of diamond-sharp shards cascaded downward. Arthur lunged from his hiding place, acting on a soldier's instinct. He threw his heavy wool coat over his head and tackled Elara, shielding her body with his own as the glass disintegrated around them. The sound was deafening, 1,000 tiny bells screaming at once before falling into a sudden, neat, terrifying silence. They lay on the damp stone floor, surrounded by a glittering graveyard of silica. Arthur could feel the frantic, rhythmic thrumming of her heart against his chest. It didn't beat like a human's. It pulsed with a heavy, undulating throb, like the engine of a great tide. He pulled back just enough to look at her. A small cut on her cheek was weeping, but the blood wasn't quite red. It had a strange, translucent quality, like water mixed with crushed pearls. "You," Arthur breathed, his voice a jagged rasp. He didn't let go of her wrists, holding them where the skin was still bared. Beneath the moonlight, he saw it clearly. A patch of emerald scales peeking out from beneath the edge of her silk bodice, shimmering with a cold, predatory light. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the fog. It was a voice. Elara stared at him, her pale eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a strange, ancient hunger. She didn't speak, she couldn't, but her gaze pleaded with him, even as her fingers curled into claws against his shoulders. "I spent 3 years thinking I was mad," Arthur whispered, his grip tightening. He felt the sting of a glass sliver in his own shoulder, but he didn't flinch. "I searched every chart, every map, looking for the monster that sang my ship into the rocks. And here you are, wearing lace and dancing the quadrille." The silence between them was heavy, with the scent of ozone and wet earth. Outside, the sounds of panicked guests and shouting footmen began to drift towards the conservatory, drawn by the sound of the destruction. Elara reached up, her damp, a cool hand trembling as she touched the scar on Arthur's temple. A gift from the day her song had broken his world. For a moment, the captain didn't see a debutante or a monster. He saw a creature as trapped in this gilded cage of London as he was. "They are coming," he warned, his eyes searching hers. "If they see you like this, if they see the marks, you won't just be a scandal. You'll be a specimen." He saw the flicker of true panic in her eyes. With a grunt of effort, Arthur pulled her to her feet, quickly draping his coat over her shoulders to hide the shimmering scales and the ruined silk. He stood between her and the doorway, a wall of navy blue and scarred pride. "Hide your hands. Lady Elara," he commanded, his voice hardening back into that of a captain. "And for God's sake, stay silent. I have questions that require more than a song to answer. But I'll be damned if I let the Admiralty find you before I do." The Mayfair townhouse was a masterpiece of Adam-style architecture, all pale plasterwork and delicate moldings. But to Elara, It felt like a drying kiln. The very walls seemed to drink the moisture from her pores. In the 3 days since the catastrophe in the conservatory, the itch beneath her ribs had transitioned into a slow, rhythmic burning. Her skin was no longer merely dry. It was becoming brittle. When she moved, she could hear the faint, terrifying rasp of scale against silk, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone. She waited until the tall clock in the foyer struck 2, its chime muffled by the thick carpets of the upper landing. Moving with the practiced silence of a predator, she slipped out of her bedchamber. She wore only a simple chemise of fine lawn and a heavy velvet cloak, its deep hood pulled low to shadow her face. In her hand, she clutched a jar of expensive French pomade, not for its scent, but for the oil, a pathetic attempt to mimic the slickness of the deep. The streets of London at night were a different world from the sunlit parades of Hyde Park. Here, the shadows were deeper, flavored with the scent of coal smoke and horse dung. Elara hurried towards the river, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. Every step away from the dampness of her wash basin felt like a step toward a shallow grave. She could feel the salt in her blood calling out for its skin, a desperate magnetic pull toward the water. When she reached the banks of the Thames near Westminster, the moon was a silver coin tossed into a gutter. The river didn't flow so much as it slithered, a dark, viscous serpent of effluent and industrial runoff. Elara scrambled down the slick stone steps of a private landing, her heart pounding against the emerald armor forming beneath her shift. She didn't hesitate. She knelt at the water's edge and plunged her hands into the dark flow. The shock was not of cold, but of poison. The water was thick with the filth of 1,000,000 souls, tallow from the chandlers, blood from the tanneries, and the bitter metallic tang of the city's many sins. Instead of the bracing, crystalline embrace of the Atlantic, the Thames felt like liquid ash. A strangled cry died in her throat. She pulled her chemise aside, exposing the iridescent shimmer of her side to the moonlight. The scales were dull, their usual vibrant sea glass green turned a muddy, sickly grey. She splashed the river water over her skin, desperate for relief, but it felt as though she were washing herself in acid. The pollution bit into the sensitive membranes between the scales, an agonizing sting that made her vision swim. She collapsed onto the damp stones, her fingers clawing at the mud. The realization hit her with the weight of a lead keel. The river would not save her. It was a dead thing, choked by the progress of man, and she was a creature of the primordial deep. "I am dying," she whispered, the words sounding like the rustle of parchment. It was the first time she had spoken aloud in weeks, and the sound was thin, stripped of its oceanic power. London was a trap. The city of gold was a gilded desert where she would slowly desiccate until she was nothing but a beautiful, silent husk found in a Mayfair bed. Her aunt's plan to marry her off to the highest bidder had shifted from a matter of social climbing to a desperate race for biological survival. She thought of the suitors who had lined up to dance with the silent diamond. The Duke of Cumberland was wealthy beyond measure, but his estates were in the landlocked heart of the Midlands, a death sentence. The Earl of Ashbourne offered a title and a palace in London, another cage. Then there was the man who already knew her secret. Captain Arthur Stirling was a man of the sea, but more importantly, his family seat sat on the jagged, spray-drenched cliffs of Cornwall. Blackwood Manor, though she had seen sketches of it in the library. A house built into the very rock, where the cellar flooded at high tide, and the windows were constantly crusted with salt. It was a marriage of convenience in the most literal sense. She did not need a husband for his heart or his name. She needed his coastline. She needed a place where the water was clean and the salt was thick enough to breathe. But Arthur was a man who hunted monsters. He had seen the scales. He had heard the song that broke his world. To wed him was to step into the lion's den. But to stay in London was to wither on the vine. Elara stood up, her cloak heavy with the stench of the river. She pulled it tight around her, hiding the graying scales and the trembling of her hands. She had to be more than a diamond. She had to be a siren again, in just long enough to lure a captain into a different kind of wreck. As she climbed back up towards the street, she didn't see the shadow standing in the lee of the bridge. She didn't see the glow of a small cigar or the glint of naval buttons in the dark. Arthur Sterling watched her go, his eyes narrowed as he looked at the oily residue she had left on the stones. He stepped forward, dipping his own fingers into the water where she had knelt. He pulled them back, smelling the strange metallic tang and the faint, lingering scent of the deep ocean. A scent that had no business being in the heart of London. The drawing room of the Duchess of Richmond was a glittering cage of gold leaf and predatory ambition. For Elara, the evening was an exercise in physical agony. The failed immersion in the Thames had left her skin feeling like scorched parchment, and the heavy velvet of her gown, intended to hide the dulling scales on her arms, felt like a shroud. She stood by the marble fireplace, desperate for the cool touch of the stone, while the silent diamond persona she had so carefully constructed began to feel like a trap. It is truly a marvel, isn't it? A voice, sharp as a darning needle, cut through the hum of the crowd. Lady Juliana Thorne, a girl with the eyes of a fox, and a father who sat on the board of Admiralty, glided forward. She had spent the season in Elara's shadow, and tonight she clearly intended to step into the light. To be so beautiful, and yet so utterly hollow, Juliana continued, her voice loud enough to draw a circle of curious onlookers. A diamond is prized for its clarity. A Lady Elara, but a woman is prized for her accomplishments. We have all heard the rumors that you are a prodigy of the Piano-Forte, yet you never play. One might begin to wonder if the silent diamond is simply a clever mask for a lack of talent. A hush fell over the room. In the corner, Elara saw Captain Arthur Sterling straighten, his hand going instinctively to the hilt of his ceremonial sword. His eyes met hers, a silent warning, or perhaps a challenge, flashing in their dark depths. A performance, then, the Duchess decreed, sensing the scent of blood in the water. Come, Lady Elara, the Broadwood is freshly tuned. Let us hear the music of the silence. There was no escape. To refuse would be social suicide. To fail would be exposure. Elara moved to the instrument, her gait fluid and haunting, though her heart felt like a trapped bird beating against the emerald cage of her ribs. As she sat, the heat of the room seemed to intensify. The dry air scratched at her throat. She looked at the ivory keys, then at the expectant faces of the ton, the men leaning in with hungry curiosity, the women with their fans raised like shields. She began to play. It was not the light, tinkling sonata expected of a debutante. The music she drew from the strings was dark and tidal. It was the sound of the deep current, the groan of the abyss, and the rhythmic pulse of a heart that did not belong on land. The room grew unnaturally still. Then, she did what she had spent her life fearing. She opened her mouth. She did not use her true voice. She knew that even a fraction of that power would shatter the Duchess's fine porcelain and perhaps the eardrums of every guest. Instead, she used the salt whisper, a technique of breathing and resonance that siren mothers used to soothe their young beneath the waves. It was a series of breathy, aspirated sounds, more air than note, a haunting sibilance that mimicked the rush of a retreating tide. It wasn't singing in any human sense. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic sighing that seemed to bypass the ears and vibrate directly in the blood. The effect was instantaneous and unsettling. The men in the room began to lean forward, their expressions vacant, their eyes glazed with a sudden, inexplicable longing. Lord Alvanley let his champagne flute tilt dangerously, the liquid spilling unnoticed onto his waistcoat. They were caught in the pull, and drawn to the piano as if to the edge of a cliff. But the women felt something else. A primal chill swept through the salon. Lady Juliana's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. She clutched her pearls, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. To the women, the sound was not a call. It was a warning. It was the sound of the predator in the surf, the thing that steals husbands and sons and never gives them back. Arthur Sterling stood unmoving, his jaw tight. He was the only man who didn't look entranced. He looked like a man watching a storm break over the bow of his ship. He recognized the frequency. It was the same low, vibrating hum that had preceded the glass shattering in the conservatory, but refined into a weapon of social seduction. Elara brought the music to a crashing, dissonant end, and the silence that followed was heavy, almost physical. The men blinked, as if waking from a dream, looking confused and strangely hollowed out. The Duchess forgot to applaud. "My word," someone whispered, the sound like a gunshot in the quiet. Lady Juliana backed away, her face ashen. That was not music," she stammered, her voice trembling. "That was unholy." Elara rose from the bench, her movement stiff. The effort of containing her voice had been more exhausting than the drought. She could feel the scales on her side burning, the grey dullness spreading. She needed to leave, but she could see the way the men were looking at her now, not with admiration, but with an obsessive, terrifying devotion. As she made her way toward the exit, Arthur Sterling stepped into her path. He didn't speak, but he offered his arm. His touch was firm, grounding her against the dizzying pull of her own nature. "A masterful performance, Lady Elara," he said, his voice low enough only for her to hear. "But you've traded one suspicion for another. They no longer think you are hollow. Now, they are beginning to realize you are dangerous." He led her out toward the terrace, but as they stepped into the night air, Elara saw the way the other women moved to avoid her path. The silent diamond had been cut, and the edge was far sharper than anyone in Mayfair was prepared for. The air in Lord Melville's ballroom was an insult to the lungs. It was a thick, stagnant soup of lavender water and expensive snuff, heated by the frantic movement of 300 bodies and the relentless glow of 1,000 wax candles. For Elara, every breath was a sandpaper rasp against her throat, and the silent diamond was starting to fracture. The grey dulling film on her skin was thickening, and the itching beneath her corset had become a searing, constant heat. She stood at the edge of the dance floor, her fan moving in a desperate, rhythmic arc that did little to stir the heavy air. She felt the weight of the room's gaze. Since the night of the Piano-Forte duel, she had become a creature of terrifying fascination. The men watched her with a glazed predatory hunger. The women whispered behind painted silk, their eyes sharp with a fear they couldn't quite name. "They are waiting for you to stumble," a voice murmured near her ear. Arthur Sterling stepped out of the crowd. He looked striking in his formal naval blues, the silver lace on his cuffs catching the light. There was a grim set to his jaw, and an intensity in his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept since the conservatory. "They are waiting for a performance," Elara's eyes replied, though her lips remained sealed. "Then let us give them something to gossip about," he said, bowing with a stiff, military precision. "Lady Elara, the orchestra is beginning a waltz. I believe you owe me a dance for keeping your secrets." The waltz was still a scandal in 1812, a dizzying, intimate carousel that forced a level of physical proximity that was unheard of in the quadrille. As Arthur led her onto the floor, the room seemed to go quiet, the only sound the frantic sawing of the violins. He took her hand, and even through the layers of her silk glove, Elara felt the jolt of his touch. He was warm, vibrantly, terrifyingly human, while she felt like a piece of cooling marble, and the dance was vigorous. Arthur moved with a surprising, athletic grace, spinning her through the crowd with a speed that made the world blur into a smear of gold and candlelight. The movement was a torture for her parched skin. The friction of her gown against her ribs felt like a blade, and the silk of her long gloves strained against the swelling of the scales on her forearms. As they spun past a heavy gilded pillar, Elara's arm caught on a sharp, ornamental sconce. There was a sickening, audible sound of tearing fabric. Elara gasped, the sound a soft, melodic chime that made the nearby dancers falter. She felt the cool air of the ballroom hit the skin of her wrist for the first time. The silk glove had split from the thumb to the mid-forearm, the delicate material hanging in useless tatters. Arthur saw it instantly, and beneath the ruined silk, there was no pale, aristocratic skin. There was a patch of iridescent, shimmering green, vibrant, chitinous scales that caught the candlelight and threw it back in a kaleidoscopic spray of emerald and seafoam. It was a mark of the abyss, undeniable and alien. Elara froze, her heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm. The world seemed to slow. A nearby countess began to turn her head, her fan dropping an inch, as her eyes drifted toward Elara's bared arm. But before the woman could see, Arthur acted. He didn't pull away in horror. He didn't call for the heralds or denounce her as the siren who had wrecked his ship. Instead, he tightened his grip, his large calloused hand sliding over the breach in the silk. He clamped his palm firmly over the shimmering scales, his thumb pressing into the sensitive membrane of her wrist. The contact was electric. His warmth seared her cold skin, but he didn't let go. "Keep dancing," he hissed under his breath, his face inches from hers. "Look at me, only at me." He pulled her closer than was strictly proper, his broad shoulder obscuring her arm from the rest of the room. He continued the waltz, his steps more forceful now, forcing her to follow his lead as he steered them toward a shadowed alcove draped in heavy velvet. The moment they were shielded by the curtains, he pinned her gently against the wall. He did not remove his hand from her wrist. He kept the scales hidden beneath the weight of his palm, his fingers feeling the strange, rhythmic pulse of her blood. "You're a fool to be here," he whispered, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "You are drying out, and I can feel the heat coming off you." Elara looked up at him, her eyes wide and glassy with unshed brine. She couldn't speak, but she leaned into him, her forehead resting against his medals. The scent of him, salt and cedar and honest sweat, was more intoxicating than any perfume. "I saw them," Arthur said, his voice softening. "I saw the color. It's the same as the water in the cove, the same as the eyes of the thing that watched me from the rocks." He slowly lifted his hand, just enough to look at the scales again. In the dim light of the alcove, they glowed with a faint internal light, beautiful and terrifying. Instead of revulsion, a look of profound, agonizing conflict crossed his face. "I should deliver you to the Admiralty," he murmured. "My duty is to the crown. My duty is to the men I lost." Elara reached out with her other hand, her fingers trembling as she touched the silver lace of his scarf. She didn't plead. She simply waited for the judgment. Arthur looked at the tear in her glove, then back at her face. The face of the woman who had captivated London and the monster who had broken his life. With a sharp, decisive movement, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean linen handkerchief. He wrapped it tightly around her wrist, tucking the ends under the remains of her glove, hiding the green beneath a layer of white. "The Admiralty is looking for a sea devil," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "But I think I've found something far more dangerous. A partner." He leaned in, his breath warm against her ear. "I will help you find the water, Elara. Not because I forgive you, but because I want to know why a queen of the ocean is dying in a city of dust." As he led her back out into the light, the handkerchief firmly in place, Elara felt a new kind of vibration in her chest. It wasn't the song of the deep, but a frantic terrestrial hope. The captain had seen the monster, and instead of killing it, he had covered its shame. The Admiralty building at Whitehall was a fortress of cold stone and colder intentions. It lacked the candlelight and perfume of Mayfair, smelling instead of old parchment, stale tobacco, and the salt-heavy ambition of men who mapped the world from behind mahogany desks. Arthur Sterling walked through the echoing corridors, the rhythmic strike of his boots against the floor sounding like a drumbeat to his own execution. He still felt the ghost of Elara's wrist beneath his palm, the terrifying electric pulse of her scales and the desperate heat of her dying skin. He was ushered into the private sanctum of Admiral Sir Peregrine Croft, a man whose face was a map of naval campaigns and whose eyes were as unforgiving as a winter sea. Croft didn't look up from his charts as Arthur entered. "Sit, Sterling," the Admiral barked. "I've no time for the pleasantries of the ballroom. I assume your time among the peacocks has been fruitful? Or have you been too distracted by the silent diamond to remember why the crown pays for your commission?" Arthur stiffened, his hand reflexively going to his side, where he had tucked away the torn, silk-stained glove he had taken from Elara. "My objectives remain clear, sir. I am monitoring the movements of the Cornish interests and investigating the anomalies reported near the Lizard Peninsula." Croft finally looked up, his gaze piercing. He slid a dossier across the desk. It was thick, stained with seawater, and bore the seal of the Intelligence Department. "The anomalies have a name now, Captain. Our spies in Paris report that Napoleon is obsessed with a legend, a sea devil that can shatter timber with a scream and call the tides to do its bidding. We thought it was folklore to explain away the incompetence of wrecked captains. Then we lost the Hesperus." Arthur's heart hammered a jagged rhythm against his ribs. "The Hesperus was lost to fog and reef, sir. I was there." "You were there and you survived," Croft said, leaning forward. "Which is why you are uniquely qualified to help us secure the asset. We are no longer looking for a monster to slay, Sterling. We are looking for a weapon to wield. Imagine a frigate that doesn't need cannons, a single voice that can vibrate the hull of a French man-of-war until the rivets pop like corks. If we find this creature, we can end the blockade of Boulogne in a single afternoon. We can win the war before the year is out. Arthur felt a cold sweat break across his brow. He saw the conservatory in his mind, the way the crystal had atomized into dust at a single, strangled hum from Elara's throat. He saw the way she had looked at him, terrified and fragile, a creature of the limitless ocean dying in a city of dust. To the Admiralty, she wasn't a woman or even a living soul. She was a biological cannon, a tool to be caged and used until her throat bled for the king. "And how do you propose to find such a creature in the middle of London, Admiral?" Arthur asked. His voice a masterpiece of forced neutrality. "The creature needs the salt, Sterling. It is biological fact. It cannot survive long on land without becoming brittle. Our surgeons believe it would seek out the river, or perhaps manifest signs of physical distress, shimmering skin, a loss of speech, a frantic need for moisture." Croft tapped the desk. "The rumors of the silent diamond have reached even these halls. A girl who never speaks, who never removes her gloves, who shatters glass when she breathes too hard. It's a bit coincidental, wouldn't you say?" The room seemed to tilt. Arthur realized with a sickening clarity that the net was closing. He had spent years hating the thing that took his crew, dreaming of the day he would find the monster and exact his revenge. But the woman who had collapsed into his arms in the alcove was no monster. She was a refugee. "Lady Elara Vance is a debutante of high standing, sir," Arthur said, the lie tasting like ash. Her silence is a matter of Victorian modesty. To suggest she is a sea devil would be a scandal that would ruin her family and make the Admiralty a laughingstock. "Then prove it," Croft countered. "Attend the gala at the Earl of Harrington's tomorrow. The Admiralty has developed a test, a concentrated solution of brine and specific minerals. If it touches the skin of such a creature, the reaction is unmistakable. The scales will flare. The creature will be forced to reveal itself." Croft reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, lead-stoppered vial. He pushed it toward Arthur. "Apply this to her skin. If she is what we suspect, bring her to the Black Tower. If she isn't, you may go back to your quadrilles." Arthur picked up the vial. It felt heavy as a cannonball. He was being asked to betray the woman who had looked at him with the first spark of hope he had seen in 3 years. He thought of his men, of Higgins and Young, and the boys who had vanished into the foam. Duty demanded he open that vial. It demanded he hand her over to the surgeons, who would undoubtedly carve her open to see how her throat worked. But then he remembered the scent of her, the sharp, clean smell of the deep Atlantic that had briefly cut through the filth of London. He remembered the way he had covered her wrist with his own hand, shielding her secret from the world. He stood and saluted, on the vial tucked into his palm. "I will do what is necessary for the crown, Admiral." As he stepped out into the grey London afternoon, the fog was rolling in from the Thames, thick and yellow. Arthur looked toward Mayfair, toward the house where Elara was likely sitting in a dry room, her skin turning to stone. He had to choose. He could be the man who saved the British fleet, or the man who saved the monster. And as the first droplets of a cold rain began to fall, Arthur realized with a start that he no longer knew which one was which. Vauxhall Gardens was a labyrinth of artificial delight and very real danger. Amidst the groves of illuminated trees and the pavilions of Chinese silk, the dark walk offered a perilous sanctuary for those seeking to escape the prying eyes of the ballroom. For Elara, the shadows were a necessity. The Admiralty's shadow loomed like a guillotine, and the vial Arthur carried. She knew he had it, had seen the weight of it in his pocket. Felt like a betrayal she wasn't yet ready to name. She moved deeper into the unlit paths, where the scent of the nearby Thames was at its strongest, though still tainted. She leaned against a gnarled oak, her fingers tracing the rough bark, finding a strange comfort in its age. But the silence of the woods was interrupted by the dry, rhythmic snap of a twig. "It is a long way from the Atlantic, is it not, Lady Elara?" The voice was like the rasp of a funeral shroud against a stone floor. The Earl of Morvain stepped from behind a weeping willow. He was a man of skeletal thinness, his eyes deep-set and burning with a feverish intellectual greed. Yet he was known for his vast library of forbidden texts and a peculiar interest in the old sciences, the alchemy of the deep and the geometry of the stars. "Do not bother with the silent act," Morvan said, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I have read the scrolls of the Phoenicians. I have seen the sketches found in the ruins of Pompeii. I knew what you were the moment I saw you waltz. The way you move, as if the air itself is a burden you must push through. You do not dance, my lady. You navigate." Elara backed away, but the path was narrow, and he stepped into her light. He held a small, weathered piece of parchment, a sketch of a creature that looked hauntingly like the reflection she saw in her wash basin on the bad days. "The Admiralty wants a weapon for their king," Morvain sneered, his voice dropping to a hiss. "They are small-minded men. They want to win a Napoleonic war. I, however, want to win a fortune. And you, my dear, are the key to the vault." He stepped closer, the smell of formaldehyde and ancient dust clinging to him like a second skin. "My rival, the Marquis of Vane, has a merchant fleet returning from the Indies. The Lady Isabel is the lead ship, carrying a cargo of spices and silk that would fund my research for a decade. She passes the estuary at dawn. You will be there. You will sing. You will call the rocks to rise and the hull to break." Elara felt a cold fury begin to stir beneath her scales. It was a different sensation than the desperate hunger for salt. It was the awakening of the predator. "And if I refuse?" Her eyes challenged, her jaw tight. "Then I go to Sir Peregrine Croft," Morvain replied smoothly. "I tell him exactly who and what the Silent Diamond is. I imagine the surgeons at the Black Tower would be very interested to see if a siren's heart beats faster when it is removed from the chest. Or perhaps they will simply want to see how many notes you can scream before your lungs fail in a dry room. Either way, you will be vocal." The threat was a physical blow. Elara looked at him, seeing the cruelty of a man who viewed the world as a collection of specimens to be pinned under glass. She thought of Arthur, torn between his duty and the strange, burgeoning thing between them. She thought of the Lady Isabel, filled with sailors who had families, who had dreams, who had done nothing but cross her path. She realized then that her silence had been a shield, but it was also a shroud. By refusing to speak, she had allowed others to write her story, to make her a diamond, a weapon, or a monster. Morvain thought he was talking to a girl who was afraid of a scandal. He didn't realize he was talking to a creature that could swallow the moon if it was hungry enough. The vibration started in the base of her throat. It wasn't the soft hum of the Conservatory or the hypnotic whisper of the Piano-Forte. It was a jagged, resonant growl, a sound that felt like the grinding of tectonic plates. The lanterns nearby flickered, the oil inside them agitated by the frequency. "You want a song, my lord?" Her silence seemed to scream. She stepped toward him, her height appearing to grow as she shed the shrinking modesty of the debutante. Her eyes, usually a pale, clouded blue, flared with a brilliant, bioluminescent green. The Earl's smirk faltered, and he took a half-step back, his hand trembling as he held the parchment. The very ground seemed to thrum beneath his boots. "I am not a tool," she thought, the resonance building until her very skin seemed to hum. "I am the tide." She didn't sing. Not yet. But the realization had taken root. To save herself, to save Arthur, and perhaps even to save the sailors Morvain marked for death, she could no longer hide behind the mask of the mute girl. The silent diamond was a lie. She was the Siren of Mayfair. And it was time London learned that the sea does not negotiate with the shore. She turned her back on the Earl and vanished into the fog of the gardens, leaving him shivering in a silence that felt far more dangerous than any scream. The night at the Wapping Docks was thick with a yellow, sulphurous fog that tasted of coal dust and despair. Arthur Stirling was bound to a rotting timber piling, the brackish water of the incoming tide already lapping at his boots. Above him, on the slick wooden wharf, the Earl of Morvain stood like a carrion crow, the silver head of his cane catching the flickering light of a single distant lantern. "You see, Captain, duty is a fine thing until it meets the reality of the abyss," Morvan sneered, looking down into the dark water. Behind him, two hulking men, hired brutes from the rookeries, held heavy pistols leveled at Arthur's chest. "I knew you wouldn't be able to resist following her. You have the look of a man who would chase a storm just to see how it ends." Arthur spat a mouthful of blood into the river. He had been ambushed a block from the tavern where he'd hoped to intercept Elara. "She isn't a tool for your greed, Morvain. She's more than you could ever understand." "She is a fortune," Morvan countered, "and if she does not appear soon to save her favorite sailor, she will be a tragedy." From the shadows of the warehouse behind them, a vibration began. It wasn't a sound at first, but a pressure that made the very air feel heavy, as if the atmospheric weight of the ocean had suddenly descended upon the London docks. Then, Elara stepped into the light. She had shed her cloak. Her gown of pale silk was already translucent from the mist, clinging to her like a second skin. Beneath the fabric, the emerald glow of her scales was no longer a secret. It was a beacon, pulsing with a rhythmic, violent light. Her eyes were no longer those of a debutante, but wide, predatory orbs of shifting seafoam green. Morvan laughed, though the sound was brittle. "Ah, Aunt the Diamond, just in time. The Lady Isabel is entering the estuary. Give me my wreck, Lady Elara, or the captain joins the silt." Elara looked at Arthur. In the dim light, she saw the bruises on his face and the way the rising river threatened to pull him under. For weeks, she had been a prisoner of her own silence, a creature of the deep, trapped in a cage of etiquette. But looking at the man who had protected her secret, she realized that silence was no longer a refuge. It was a weapon she had forgotten how to wield. She opened her mouth. The sound that emerged was not a hum. It was a shattering, polyphonic scream that tore through the night. It was the sound of 1,000 glass bells breaking against the hull of a ship. It was the roar of the North Sea in a winter gale. The reaction was instantaneous. The Thames, usually a sluggish, a polluted artery, began to heave. A localized storm erupted with a violence that defied the laws of nature. Thunder didn't roll. It cracked like a whip over the docks. The oily water rose in a massive churning swell, a wall of black liquid that swept over the wharf with the force of a battering ram. Morvoin's hired men were tossed aside like rag dolls, their pistols firing uselessly into the churning sky. The Earl himself let out a thin, terrified shriek as the river surged up to claim him, his skeletal frame disappearing beneath the foam. But Elara was already moving. As the wharf began to splinter under the pressure of the rising tide, she dove. Arthur felt the ropes snap as the water hammered into him, pulling him down into the lightless, freezing depths of the Thames. He scrambled for the surface, but the weight of his wool coat and the sheer violence of the current dragged him under. His lungs burned. The world turned into a blur of black silt and silver bubbles. Then he felt it. A hand, cold as ice but incredibly strong, gripped his waist. He was pulled upward with a speed that made his head swim. When they broke the surface, the world was a chaos of wind and spray. They were near the crumbling masonry of a bridge, shielded from the worst of the debris. Arthur gasped for air, clutching at the stone. He looked at his savior and forgot to breathe again. The silk of Elara's gown had been mostly torn away by the water. She was no longer a lady in a dress. She was a goddess of the salt. Iridescent green and gold scales covered her throat, her shoulders, and her long, powerful limbs. Fine, translucent fins, like delicate lace made of moonlight, shimmered along her spine and outer arms. Her hair floated around her like a web of dark kelp, and her fingers ended in sharp, elegant points. She was terrifying. She was the monster of his nightmares, the thing that had broken the Hesperus. But as she reached out to brush the wet hair from his eyes, her touch was agonizingly tender. She let out a soft, melodic trill, not a scream of destruction, but a sound of profound, aching relief. In that moment, the predator and the debutante were gone, leaving only the creature who had chosen a man's life over her own anonymity. The storm she had called began to subside as quickly as it had arrived, leaving the Thames settle into a shamed, quiet ripple. Arthur looked at her, his hand reaching out to touch the shimmering scales on her shoulder. He didn't pull away. "You're beautiful," he whispered, his voice trembling from the cold and the awe. Elara bowed her head, a single crystalline tear falling from her eye and disappearing into the river. She had saved him, but she had destroyed the silent diamond forever. London was no longer an option. The Admiralty would be coming. The Tun would be horrified. She looked toward the east, where the river flowed out toward the sea. She pointed, a silent question in her emerald eyes. Arthur tightened his grip on her hand. "Yes," he said, his voice regaining its strength. "To the coast, to Cornwall, to the salt." The carriage rattled over the rutted tracks of the Great West Road, the rhythmic thud of hooves a frantic heartbeat against the silence of the night. Inside the cramped, velvet-lined cabin, the air was thick with the scent of damp wool, river silt, and the sharp ozone tang that still radiated from Elara's skin. She was wrapped in Arthur's heavy naval greatcoat, the brass buttons cold against her collarbone, but the heat she generated was unnatural. The transformation was receding, the iridescent scales retreating beneath her skin like cooling embers, leaving her exhausted and achingly fragile. Arthur sat opposite her, his face a mask of bruised shadows and grim resolve. He had lost his hat in the Thames, and his hair was plastered to his forehead with mud and salt. He didn't look like a hero of the Napoleonic Wars. He looked like a man who had just committed high treason and found he didn't regret it. "We will reach Blackwood by dawn the day after next," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to steady the air. "My family's estate in Cornwall is not a palace, Elara. It is a fortress built into the granite. The cellar is flooded with every high tide, and the spray hits the library windows when the wind is from the south. You will have the salt there. You will have the water." Elara looked down at her hands. They were pale and slender again, the sharp points of her nails softening back into porcelain curves. But the green shimmer still lingered around her cuticles, a reminder of the predator that had clawed its way out of her in the whopping fog. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the rough wool of his sleeve. She wanted to thank him, to scream her gratitude, but the effort to speak felt like trying to pull a harp string through a bed of sand. "Why?" she thought, her eyes searching his. "I am the nightmare that haunts your charts. I am the reason you wake up in a cold sweat, hearing the screams of the Hesperus." "I know what you're thinking," Arthur said, as if he could read the bioluminescent flickers in her gaze. He leaned forward, taking her hand in his. His palm was warm and solid, an anchor in a world that was currently dissolving into chaos. "I should hate you. By every law of the crown and every memory of my crew, I should have handed you to Croft. But I watched you in that river, Elara. You didn't sing to kill. You sang to save. You chose a man's life over your own safety." He squeezed her hand, his thumb brushing over the spot where her scales had so recently flared. "The Admiralty is closing in. Croft has agents at every port from Dover to Bristol. They aren't looking for a debutante anymore. They are looking for a sea devil. If they find us, I will be hanged for a traitor, and you will be a prize for the king's surgeons." Elara felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the night air. She looked out the carriage window at the dark silhouette of the English countryside. To remain with Arthur was to bring the weight of the British Empire down upon his head. She was a creature of the deep, a sovereign of the tides. He was a man of duty and honor. How could a sailor love the storm that wrecked him? The conflict tore at her more fiercely than the drought of London ever had. Part of her, the part that had worn silk and waltzed at Almack's, wanted to stay in the warmth of his coat, to find a way to be the silent diamond for him in a house by the sea. She wanted to learn the language of his world, to taste the bread and wine of the land, and forget the cold, unlonely hunger of the abyss. But the other part of her, the older part, felt the call of the Atlantic like a physical ache. The river had been a poison, but the open sea, she could feel it even now, miles away, a vast blue consciousness calling her home. Down there she wasn't a specimen or a scandal. She was the apex. She was free. "You don't have to decide now," Arthur whispered, noticing the way her gaze drifted toward the horizon. "But you must understand, Elara. At Blackwood, you won't be a secret to hide. You'll be my wife, Lady Stirling, or you will be gone, and I will be a man who spends the rest of his life watching the waves, wondering if the foam is just the sea, or if it's you." The carriage lurched as they turned onto a narrower path, heading toward the coast. The smell of the city was finally fading, replaced by the faint, on unmistakable scent of gorse and salt spray. Elara closed her eyes, leaning her head against the cool glass. She was a woman who loved a sailor and a predator who belonged to the deep. For the first time in her life, she realized that the greatest danger wasn't the Admiralty's knives or the Earl's greed. It was the fact that her heart was now as divided as the shoreline itself, caught forever between the land she could not breathe in and the sea she could no longer bear to return to alone. Behind them, far on the eastern horizon, the first faint glow of a London morning began to rise. But for Arthur and Elara, there was only the long, dark road toward the sound of the crashing waves. The granite cliffs of Cornwall did not welcome the Admiralty. They stood as a jagged warning, the teeth of stone ready to tear the belly from any ship that dared come too close. At the edge of the world, Blackwood Manor clung to the precipice, its lower chambers already sighing with the breath of the rising tide. Arthur stood on the narrow stone terrace, his spyglass trained on the horizon. 3 frigates, their sails ghost-white against the charcoal sky, were tacking toward the cove. Admiral Croft had not come for a social call. The flagship, the Invincible, carried the heavy weight of the Crown's desperation. They had come to claim their weapon. "They won't stop, Elara," Arthur said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the surf below. He turned to find her standing in the spray, her hair whipped into a dark frenzy by the gale. "They will batter these walls down to get to you." Elara stepped to the very edge of the stone, and she was no longer wearing silk. She wore a shift of simple linen, and beneath it, the emerald fire was blinding. The grey London film was gone, replaced by a luster so deep it seemed to swallow the light. She looked at the approaching ships, the men on deck, the cannons being run out, the cold iron of human ambition. She looked at Arthur one last time. In her eyes, he saw the final surrender of the debutante. She reached out, her hand now fully shimmering with iridescent scales, and pressed a palm to his cheek. It was a goodbye to the silence and a greeting to the storm. Without a word, she stepped off the cliff. Arthur let out a cry of terror, rushing to the edge, but he did not see her fall. He saw a streak of emerald light hit the churning foam. A moment later, the sea itself seemed to wake up. From the depths of the cove, a vibration began that made the very foundation of Blackwood Manor tremble. It wasn't a note, it was a cathedral of sound. Elara opened her throat and gave the Atlantic everything she had been holding back since she was a child. The song began as a low, mournful cello, pulling the fog from the horizon like a thick, grey blanket. It rolled over the waves, swallowing the frigates in a matter of seconds. Inside the mist, the sailors did not hear a monster. They heard the voices of their mothers, the laughter of their wives, the call of every dream they had ever abandoned for the sea. The Invincible wavered. On its deck, Admiral Croft gripped the railing, his face ashen. He had wanted a weapon to shatter timber, but he had found a melody that shattered the will. Elara did not lead them to the rocks, and she remembered the splintering of the Hesperus and the blood in the foam. She chose a different path. She swam before the lead ship, her song acting as a golden thread through the blinding white. She led them away from the jagged teeth of the Maiden's Reef, guiding them toward a sheltered sandy bay 5 miles down the coast, a place where the water was shallow and the currents were gentle, but where the heavy-keeled frigates would find themselves hopelessly grounded in the silt, unable to move until the next great spring tide. She led the British fleet, into a peaceful trap. As the last ship slid into the soft embrace of the sandbar, the song shifted. It became a lullaby, a heavy hypnotic resonance that sent the panicked crews into a deep, unnatural slumber. The fog remained, a protective shroud that would take days to dissipate, and by which time the Sea Devil would be a ghost story once again. Arthur waited on the shore as the tide began to retreat. He stood where the water met the granite, his heart a frantic drum. Then, out of the receding foam, she emerged. She crawled onto the sand, her scales dulling as the air hit them, her lungs gasping for the thinner oxygen of the land. She was exhausted, her throat raw from the power she had unleashed. Arthur didn't wait. He waded into the surf and scooped her up, holding the sea goddess as if she were made of the finest glass. "It's over," he whispered into her damp hair. "They are safe. You are safe." Years later, the people of the Cornish coast still spoke of the Lady of Blackwood. They called her the Silent Lady Stirling, for she never spoke a word in the village, and she never attended the balls in Truro. Nor they whispered about the way she only ever wore high collars and long gloves, and how she seemed to grow younger whenever a storm broke over the coast. At Blackwood Manor, the house that sat half over the waves, life was measured by the tides. In the evenings, when the moon was high and the salt spray crusted the windows, Arthur would sit by the fire and read aloud from books of poetry and navigation, and Elara, sitting in a chair carved from driftwood, would watch him with eyes the color of a summer sea. She was still silent to the world, but in the private hours of the night, when the doors were locked and the only audience was the ocean, she would hum. It was a soft, gentle sound, not a weapon, but a prayer. And as Arthur held her hand, feeling the faint, rhythmic pulse of her scales beneath his thumb, he knew that he hadn't married a debutante or a monster. He had married the sea itself, and he had never been more at home.